Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mei Guo. I'm a faculty member at School of Social Work, University of Iowa. You may notice my virtual background is set at the beach, perhaps in Hawaii. Actually, I'm currently in Hawaii on my sabbatical leave at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I really appreciate this opportunity that I won't be physically at Iowa City, but I will be able to share with you some of my research relating to immigration and aging. So today I will be presenting together with my colleague Wang, Dr. Wang, also as a faculty member at School of Social Work. In the following presentation, we'll talk about immigration, aging, and how the immigration process affects the social context of aging, and as well as the well-being of older adults. And we'll also present a case of Chinese older immigrants in the United States.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wang. I am an assistant professor at the School of Social Work here at the University of Iowa. It is my great honor to participate in the Iowa Asian Summit and to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Aging and Longevity Studies program with you. Along with my colleague, Dr. Mei Guo, we will be presenting issues related to aging and immigration in the United States.
So in today's presentation, we'll start by providing you with a very general background information of trend and demographics of international migrants, both in the globe and also in the United States. And then we'll describe briefly to what extent and how immigration to a new country changes social context of aging for those immigrants. And at last, we'll present a case study of the changing social context of aging of Chinese older immigrants in the United States, which is a population of both Dr. Wang and my research focus. Before we start to talk about changing social context of aging, let's take a look at, for instance, some demographics of international migrants and specifically older immigrants in the globe. So if you think about the contemporary era and all the demographic changes occurring, aging and immigration, those are the two most formidable demographic changes in the whole world. This chart shows between 2010 and 2015, different continents in terms of their either receiving immigrants, such as Northern America, between those 5 years received 1.1 million immigrants versus the immigrant sending countries or areas such as Asia, which send out 1.1 million immigrants moving to another country. So you can see the overall trend of migration, international migration across the globe. So the kind of the major transition trend is from Asia to Northern America. And then at the same time, aging is affecting almost all the countries in the world, including the countries of the immigrant sending areas and immigrant receiving areas. Has huge implications for the old age support in both areas. And if we look at the total migrant population around the world, on the left part is a pie chart of the total people in the world. Among those 7.6 million, less than 9% are older adults. Okay? But if you look at the amount of international migrants, almost 12%, much higher percentage of the migrants are older adults. Might be relating to the fact that for many countries such as United States, family-related migration, such as if you already have an adult child, settles down in the country of receiving country, then the parents of that immigrant will be more likely to be accepted or admitted or to receive the legal immigration status in the receiving country than obtaining a work permit for younger immigrants. So there are significantly more older adults in the migration population than among the general population. we see the similar trend in the United States. So those three lines indicates, again, among the immigrant population in the United States, what are the shares of those who age 50 years old? You can see by 2017, almost 40% of US immigrants, they aged 50 and older. You can see a steady increase, meaning among US immigrant populations, there are more older immigrants compared to 10, 20 years ago. So you can see by 2017, among the US immigrants, about 15.6% are older adults, those who aged 65 and older. And another way we look at how aging and immigration, they jointly affect the demographic feature of the United States is the average age of immigrants versus average age of natives, those who were born in the United States. You can see from 2000 to 2017, again, the gap increased. By 2017, you can see there was almost an 8-year, 7.5 years difference between the immigrant population and native born. You can see the average age of immigrants in this country was 45 years old. So if you think about the average immigrant in the United States, that would be a middle-aged person versus for Americans who are native born, much younger. And where are the immigrants from? That varies depending on in which year you look at the overall picture. So 50 years ago, back in the 1970s, you can see those immigrants from Europe, Canada, they made up the vast majority of the immigrant population in the United States. Only 4% were from Asia, 6% from Mexico. Versus in 2013, you can see the largest ethnic group among immigrant populations in the United States were from Mexico, 28%, and also a similar significant share were from Southeast Asia. So the region of immigrants, where they were from, also changed from more European, Canada, more developed countries to developing countries from Latin America and Asia. Similar for older immigrants. So for older immigrants together, those who were from Latin America or Asia, they count up for almost 2/3 of the total older immigrants in the United States. Were they more recent immigrants, or they've stayed in this country for a relatively long period of time? So back in the 2010, the US Census Bureau, they asked older immigrants how long you've lived in this country. So you can see by then, 60%, more than majority, they migrated before 1970. That means they migrated 40 years ago. So they've already lived in this country for 40 years or more. And then another 20% migrated about between 30 to 40 years ago. So when we talk about older immigrants, many of them were actually aging in the country. So they didn't come to the country as older adults, but they migrated earlier and then aging in the United States as an older adult. And older immigrants in this country are vulnerable in many different aspects. Let's take a look at their economic status. So this table shows the rate of poverty among different groups of population segments. Among native, those native older adults, okay, 8% versus not a US citizen, almost 3 times more than the natives. 21% and similar poverty rates among male versus female migrants. So they are more likely to be under poverty line, and many of them, more than half. This was based on a study from Migration Policy Institute. More than half, they had difficulty speaking English, and you can see more than 40% had relatively low education less than a high school degree. And for many older immigrants, they encountered many challenges in their lives. Similar as perhaps younger immigrants, you can see there racism, discrimination, microaggression, and many moved to this country, particularly from, for instance, Latin America or South Asia, had experienced many traumas, and they suffer from PTSD. They may have more language barriers because lack of acculturation opportunities, such as going to a school or finding a job in the country to help them to be acculturated to the new country. They are likely to have lower SES, socioeconomic status, and because they may not have the whole life to accumulate to be entitled to, for instance, Social Security, Medicaid, they may have a limited access to healthcare and maybe rely more on welfare programs. And social isolation is another major risk, which will be the focus of a later discussion. So overall, in this country, you can see together aging and immigration, they shape the demographic profile of American populations, and older immigrants as a group, they fare less well in many different aspects than their native borns. But it's also important to notice that they are a very diverse group in terms of country of origin, the languages they speak, and their education level, economic resources, history of migration, etc. But to better prepare the aging as well as more diverse population in the United States, this together aging and immigration have significant implication for how social services in this country would serve the aging population. Now, with the basic information of aging and immigration trend around the globe and the United States, let's take a look at how immigration process affects the well-being of older adults. So here on this slide, this is an ecological system for the individual well-being. It tells you for individual well-being, there are different layers of impact factors. Individual itself, like the education level, their economic resources, and their personality may all affect their well-being. But individuals live not in a social vacuum. The individual also interacts with different interpersonal ties, which arguably families are one of the most important interpersonal ties one has. And also, their well-being is also affected by the community where they live, the organizations, institutions. They could include, for instance, for the younger people, the college they go to, or for people of different age, the churches that they go to, or other types of organization. And the policies, particularly as immigrants, they may encounter new sets of policies which regulate their personal behaviors, family relations, as well as how they interact with the entire society. Culture is an underlying, perhaps I would say most salient influential factor for the well-being of the lives of immigrants. I want you to think about for your own well-being. At this time of pandemics, how do different layers of stakeholders, interpersonal, your relationship with your classmates, faculty members, instructors, family members, or with the community, or the policy and the culture, how different layers affect the well-being of your your sense of well-being in the current time being. So this is a framework based on which it's really helpful for us to understand how immigration as a demographic trend affects the well-being of older adults. And as I mentioned, for different layers of stakeholders affecting individuals' life, family is inevitably the closest, most frequent interactions you may have among all those layers of interactions. And this is particularly true for older immigrants. As I mentioned earlier, many older immigrants, they came to this country, meaning United States, for the reason to join their families. So for older adults, that's the most kind of common ways of obtaining their legal status as an American citizen, to join their families, to help with their adult children, or these older adults may have healthcare needs that they opt to live with their children in another country, or it might be to help with childcare, serving as providing grant childcare to help with their adult children. And many older adults, as you can see, most of the older immigrants in this country are migrated from either Latin America or Asia. Many bring with them very strong family norms, such as filial piety, which in a few more slides, I'm going to explain what is filial piety, but similarly in Mexican cultural familism, this strong sense of interdependence of individual well-being among family members. Siva, which is term in Indian, again indicates this collective well-being among family members and importance of the family relationships for individual well-being. And if you again think about older immigrants, many of them have lower socioeconomic status. Many don't speak English. Many may not even drive a car. So the families could really be the major source of support, if not the only source of support. They could help with language brokery. They could help with, for instance, serving as the major source of support. Could be instrumental support if they need some help with household chores. Their young adults or even grandchildren might be of help, or emotional support that if they need to confide. If they have some worries, that they talk to their family members, and monetary support, which may be less common among Native Americans, but perhaps more common among immigrants, because as a unit, the immigrant families, in order to survive in the new country, in the rapidly changing social context, they need to help each other across different generations. So the family plays an important role in the well-being of older immigrants. Another way we take a look at how immigrant families are interdependent is to look at their living arrangement. So this is a study conducted about 10 years ago, but still we find similar findings even among the current cohort of immigrants. The study looked at, based on the national data, what is the percentage? What was the percentage of immigrant families or families in general? They have extended living arrangement, meaning there are more than 2 generations. So you have grandparents, parents, and children living in the same household. Such as, this is example of extended family living arrangement, multi-generational living arrangement. And you can see among whites, only 12%, and all Asians, meaning regardless of whether you are first generation Asian Americans or second generation, third generation, you can see native born, 25%. And here, if you take a closer look at different ethnic groups, Indians had the highest percent, particularly among those who were foreign born, those who were the first generation immigrants, more than half. They lived in extended family household arrangement, but much lower among those who were native born. You can see again, perhaps the culturation process has made these families more Americanized and more independent instead of interdependent. Vietnamese also more than 50%, followed by Filipinos, and Chinese 40%. Japanese is a unique group, just given their longest immigration history. Actually, among the foreign-born Japanese, they had lower percentage of extended living arrangement than the native-born. But overall, we see a much higher prevalence of multi-generational living arrangement among foreign-born immigrants than non-immigrants. Then if you think about implication, if you have multi-generational living arrangement, how does it affect your daily interaction with your family members? It's many different ways it shapes family relations. And here I want to talk about filial piety, which for many Asians particularly East Asians, that's a core family value for their, which regulate family relations. It originated from China in a Confucian teaching of xiào. The pronunciation is xiào, xiào. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Is the Chinese character for xiào. It is made of two parts. At the top, the black part, actually it's part of the word or the Chinese character of old, 老. It's part of the letter old. And then at the bottom, this is the Chinese character of 子, means son. So literally 孝, which is a family norm in China, is for the sons to provide old age support for their aging parents. So filial piety, it has a lot of family norms entailed from that Confucian teaching. It entails both the attitude, the appropriate attitudes you show to your parents, as well as the behaviors that you carry out. From the attitude perspective, filial piety or xiào indicates not only love. Okay, of course, I think in Western countries, most children love their parents, but it's more than love. It indicates difference, meaning you respect, you acknowledge that parents have the authority. In terms of a hierarchical family relations, parents have they are of higher positions or social status than the children. Courtesy considerations, and you are expected, based on the teaching, to use polite language, seeking advice for major life events, and also keep them informed regarding what's going on in your life. So here, from the respect, it entails a lot of different kind of attitudinal practice that Chinese children are supposed to carry out, to perform to their aging parents. And the care, I would say co-residency is used to be a major kind of expectation for Chinese families, particularly for families with sons, that sons are supposed to, especially the oldest son, is expected to live with their older parents. But now, even back in China, it's no longer the kind of a major expectation on their children. In China, now people emphasize more on the attitudinal, right? How you treat your parents by showing courtesy, difference, instead of providing some of the, for instance, physical care, instrumental care, providing financial support, emotional, as an emotional source of support, confident company, and also afterlife care. That's also by the Chinese traditional teaching, that's important practice of filial piety. Now you know the major tenets of filial piety. I want you to think about the difference between individualism, which is the predominant culture in this country, versus collectivism, which many immigrants from Asia, from Latin America, they bring together with them the traditional family norms of collectivism. You will see that there might be a collusion. There might be a very dramatic contrast between the individualism versus collectivism. So some traits of individualistic cultures, including self-sufficiency, okay, independence, autonomy, uniqueness, they seem to be at odds at the teaching of filial piety, traditional. So that has implication for how older immigrants in this country experience their family relationships, which are the closest social ties they have in this country. And here are some challenges they face in managing their family relations. One thing, acculturative gaps. If you are from an immigrant family, you may have first-hand experience in that. I have a first-hand experience in that, although my parents are back in China, but I do see I'm having kind of gradually departing cultural values from the traditional Chinese teaching as I spend more time living in the United States. And for many younger immigrants, even the second generation, many strive to establish in the receiving societies themselves. And many older immigrants report they do not have quality of time spending together with their sons, daughters, or grandchildren, but also likely the acculturation gaps across the generations may also explain to why some older immigrants didn't experience satisfactory family relations. And if you think about living together with your parents, together with your grandparents, that could be stressful. So just by the fact that higher proportion of Asian immigrants, they live together with their extended families may also indicate potential source of conflict among family members. And although many older immigrants, they heavily rely on their families for areas of support, that on the other side, the other side might be family might be the only source of support, and they could face possible social isolation, which would be a significant risk factor for the mental health of older immigrants. And in a worst scenario, even might be the elder abuse, which may happen in the family context. So in the next slide, my colleague, Dr. Wang, will talk about the changing social context of aging, specifically in the neighborhood context.
Now, this is Yi speaking. I guess many of us have visited ethnic neighborhoods. The Korean town, Chinatown, Little Italy, that you can find every time you travel to a large city. So usually we go to an ethnic neighborhood to try the food and celebrate traditions. It is a great opportunity to learn about the culture that has taken root there. And very naturally, we become curious about when and how their families got there. So that's related to the concept of immigrant neighborhoods. So immigrant neighborhoods refers to neighborhoods with high concentrations of fellow immigrants. A similar term that you might have heard of is ethnic enclave. So ethnic enclave refers to an area primarily populated by a population with a similar ethnic or racial background. The neighborhood has long been considered a key element of immigrant life. It has an important function for especially newcomers and those whose language and customs set them apart from the majority population in the host country. Now, you may ask, why did immigrants live in ethnic neighborhoods? Well, they settled in such neighborhoods primarily for the affordable housing, family ties, a familiar culture, job opportunities, support network, etc. What we noticed is that some immigrants settled and stayed in ethnic neighborhoods, and they did that mainly out of necessity, whereas some others stayed in such neighborhoods temporarily. They searched for non-ethnic neighborhoods as soon as their economic situations improve and they learn to navigate daily life in a more mainstream setting. So what they do is that they relocate. So they relocate to areas with better amenities. We also noticed that many new immigrants are bypassing the immigrant neighborhoods and settling in an affluent suburban neighborhood. So who are they? Well, many of these immigrants are well educated and have above average incomes. we see an increasing number of recent immigrants who arrive the United States speaking fluent English and holding advanced degrees, which help them land mainstream jobs. This is not a new phenomenon. Here I found an article published on the New York Times about 35 years ago, and the title says, "Suburbs absorbs more immigrants, mostly affluent and educated." Now, what are the characteristics of immigrant neighborhoods? Well, immigrant neighborhoods can be identified by the characteristics of the people who live in the neighborhoods. We see large concentrations of immigrants, mostly new immigrants and immigrants with few socioeconomic resources. The physical environment of immigrant neighborhoods is usually less desirable. It is common to see litter, deserted stores, and affordable housing in the neighborhood. The social environment is characterized by strong ties among the neighbors in the community, the retention of language, culture, and customs, which plays an important role in preserving ethnic identity and facilitating the process of assimilation and acculturation.
In the last part of this presentation, I would like to share with you a study that Dr. Wang and I conducted. We're looking at coping resources at individual, family, and community level, and how that affect the well-being of Chinese older immigrants in the United States. Specifically, in that study, we asked two questions. So first is, what are different types of coping resources of Chinese older immigrants have? If you recall the ecological system of individual well-being, in this study, we focus our examination on three layers of potential coping resources at individual level, interpersonal level, specifically with family and community level, which include friends. And we want to look at what are different types of coping that based on these three levels of potential coping resources, and which type is associated with the best mental health outcomes. So we used a data set from Chinese older immigrants in Chicago, greater Chicago area, which contained information of almost 3,000 Chinese older immigrants. And in the area, and the data are representative of Chinese older adults in greater Chicago. So I want to show you, this is a typology approach. We look at different possible sources of coping. At individual level, it included sense of mastery, that have a stronger sense of control of your life, and high religiosity, that you have a belief of higher being in the world, which may affect how you assess different stressful life events. And at family level, we look at relying on spouse for support, or relying on family in general. Mainly that means adult children for support. And in a community level, you have friend support and a sense of neighborhood cohesion, that you feel the neighborhood, you could rely on neighborhood for support, and people get along well in the neighborhood. And I will show you different types emerged from this study. And you can see at each end, each of the 6 dimensions is 100%, meaning 100% of older immigrants in this sample reported having high, for instance, high religiosity or high spousal support. So there are 4 types identified. So you can see the first type among the sample, only about 43%, almost half of the sample. We name it low coping resources, meaning for each domain, particularly you can see for the spousal support, it's close to almost 0. So for each domain, although it's 27, 23, 22%, very few percentage of older immigrants had any aspects of this support. So 43% of the total sample had this type of support system we call the low coping resource. And the second type, you can see now the coping resources, the overall pattern have expanded, right? If you see in the previous type, almost 0% support from the spouse. For this part, all different dimensions, except for the friend support, has expanded. And specifically for this dimension, spousal support, 92% of older adults belonging to this coping resources reported they have high spousal support. So in other words, this 32% of the sample in our study, about 1/3, spouse was their major source of support. And then the third type, we name it community-based coping. 15% of the sample were categorized as having this type of support. Some defining features of this type of coping is they have the highest, although 48, 42, they may not sound high, but compare, can see the previous types, they are relatively higher level of support from neighborhood and friend. And also can see relatively higher, it's compared to previous types reported religiosity. So in other words, in this type of coping, 15% of the sample older adults, they did not rely heavily on their spouse for support, but instead they have higher engagement in the local communities, having more friends and having a greater sense of community cohesion, and likely were more active in religious activities. The last type you can see, if you look at the shapes of different types of coping, so the last one you can see a much larger, more kind of extended support resources. Almost unanimously, these older adults, they reported that very good friend support, but also very high family support, very decent level of reported spousal support. And 50%, that is the highest among all different types, is reported having greater sense of mastery. So we didn't know which caused which, but it seems these older people, they enjoyed a greater sense of control in their lives and have many friends, reported a close relationship, received a lot of support from family, including spouse, and decent, 41% reported good neighborhood cohesion, and 20% were engaged in individual or organized religious activity. So those are the four types. You can see, reveal that 43% low coping, not really reported strong coping in any dimensions. And then 32% reported coping mainly from spouse, 15% community-based coping, and only 10% were able to mobilize coping resources from all different layers of resources. So not surprisingly, what we found later when looking at the association between different types of coping and psychological well-being measured by depressive symptoms and sense of life satisfaction in their life, those who had multi-source coping had the best, the most favorable outcomes in those dimensions. So in other words, in order for older immigrants to maintain their mental health well-being, it's really important that beyond the individual, their sense of control in their life, they could benefit from their family, strong family support and the community. Only it's when different layers of resources available and could work towards their good do these older immigrants enjoy most favorable mental health outcomes.
Now let's talk about the implications of our findings. So we certainly identified the distinctive coping repertoire among Chinese older immigrants based on different sources of coping. We identified the most vulnerable group, and that is the group of those who had low resource coping, and they accounted for more than 40% of the study sample. So future research should get a better understanding of this group and develop interventions to better target their needs so as to reduce their vulnerabilities. The finding regarding the psychological benefits among those who had more versatile coping repertoire suggested strength-based multi-source intervention that takes the person-environment perspective and really looks beyond the individual scope. So back to this conceptual framework, our findings suggest the development of interventions that involve interpersonal support and assets at the meso level. Now, this concludes our presentation. Thanks for your attention. We would love to take any questions. Thank you.